Okay, we have here today the human digestive system. The human digestive system is mainly designed to break down macromolecules into simpler forms. For example, uh, starch into glucose, and yeah, it helps in providing our body the nutrients that we need to continue on living. Now, the human digestive system, or our entire digestion, is broken down into four stages. The first is ingestion, where we take in the food that we eat, and then digestion, where this food are being broken down into simpler forms, and then absorption, where the nutrients are being taken in by our cells, tissues, via the circulatory system, and elimination, where any waste that has been gathered from digestion is being terminated from our body or eliminated from our body. There are two main groups of organs in our digestive system. The first one is the alimentary canal, or the continuous coiled hollow tube extending from our mouth down to our rectum to our anus. So it is just a singular tube that is being bent here and there, and it is hollow for food to enter, or our waste as well, in the lower ends of this hollow tube. The alimentary canal is composed of mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, and then the rectum. Now, all of these are hollow for the food to easily pass through. And then in our large intestine, this is where our wastes will be stored for elimination. Now we have here the accessory digestive systems, which are the pancreas, the appendix, the gallbladder, and liver. There are many other accessory digestive systems, but these are the most common ones. Now, each of these accessory digestive organs also have a designed purpose to contribute in the process of digestion. So they provide their own form of enzymes to help in the digestion of food. Now, the digestion of food the digestion of food begins when the food enters our mouth, where it is being physically broken down by our teeth with the help of the salivary glands to soften the food. And then within the mouth still, it is being chemically broken down by amylase, an enzyme in the saliva that breaks down carbohydrates. And there you see the different types of teeth here. So we have here the molars, which helps in grinding what do you call this? Because the canine and incisors are help in the breaking down of flesh, and then the molars are for the grinding of uh, the greens, the vegetables, the fruits, the fibers. But they also help to further grind the other types of food, such as meat and vegetables. And then the amylase in our saliva helps in breaking down carbohydrates. After the Now, while our food is being chewed, it becomes a ball called bolus. Now, if no matter how hard you try to avoid this, you cannot. Your mouth your food will always turn into a bolus because this is an in. Then this bolus passes to the pharynx or throat, and then into the epiglottis. This makes sure the bolus passes into the esophagus and not down the windpipe or our larynx. This epiglottis is like a cap or a door. Now, if you have noticed sometimes when you try to drink water uh, while you are naghihingalo or breathing heavily, you are like going to choke. You are more likely to choke on the water because yes, because the water is not intended to go down our windpipe. That's because the epiglottis is like opening and closing rapidly for the air to enter to the larynx or our windpipe. I mean, not larynx, trachea. Sorry. So it's trachea, not larynx. So the epiglottis serves as a bouncer in a club. So if the food is present, it is closed so that the food would proceed to the esophagus. And then when we inhale or exhale, this epiglottis opens for the air to pass. Ana lang na siya. Now, this bolus does not simply drop down to our stomach. It is being aided by the involuntary movement of our esophagus and the rest of the digestive system. So, since these organs are composed of smooth muscles, this movement this movement is purely involuntary. Now, we call this movement peristalsis. As you can see, it is a wave of muscular contractions that push the bolus down towards the stomach. Now, the harder the food is, or the harder the bolus is, the harder it is also to be pushed down throughout the alimentary canal. or throughout the major parts of the digestive system. However, if the bolus is very smooth, then it moves very smoothly throughout the hollow tube, the alimentary canal. As you can see, we have here the simple illustration of how peristalsis works. Now, peristalsis is a longitudinal, no, longitudinal, circular, and diagonal muscles constrict in wave-like motions, so like pulses, to, to propel the food through the gastrointestinal tract. So we have here different types of smooth muscles working together to help in the movement of the bolus. And then there's also segmentation where the small intestine squeeze the food back and forth along its wall, along its intestinal wall. Now, after it has gone through the mouth, the esophagus, the bolus now reach the stomach. Now, the stomach has also a sort of a gate called the lower esophageal sphincter. This is a tight muscle that prevents acid into the esophagus. So without this valve, uh, we would not feel really good because of the acid being propelled down to our throat, up into our throat. Yeah, just like a acid reflux. And then we have here several parts of the stomach, with each of these having their own purposes. The stomach has folds which churns the bolus, like, and mixes it with the gastric juices. Now this is a mixture of several stomach acids, mucus, and enzymes. Now this is also where further chemical digestion occurs to further break down the food or the macromolecules that we have intaken. Or is it a word? The food that we intake. The macromolecules in the food we intake are being chemically digested in the stomach. Further chemical digestion so that it is going to be easily absorbed later on the absorption stage of the digestion. Now, the stomach acid kills off any invading bacteria or viruses. However, some species of bacteria and viruses have their own mechanisms in surviving the acidic environment of our stomach, just like parasites with their phospholipid membranes that perfectly counters the acid in our stomach. That's why aji makalusot. Not entirely 100% of the invading bacteria, viruses, and parasites can be stopped by our stomach acids. because they have their own mechanisms or shielding to the acid. The enzymes help break down proteins, and then the mucus protects the lining of the stomach from being eaten away by the acid. Now, if your mucus concentration on your stomach lining is very low, or if it is being overpowered by the acid, that's when you get ulcer. And that is not very healthy to our stomach to have gas-gas, gas-gases, kana magas-gas bitaw, because of the acid. That's why we cannot have an empty stomach because at some point the acid will overpower the mucus lining and it starts to digest the stomach itself. And then here is a summary of the different enzymes that is involved in the digestion, each of each of which has their own target micronutrient and a end product. For the carbohydrates, we have the amylase, sucrase, lactase. They come from different organs. For example, the salivary amylase comes from the salivary glands. It targets starches and complex carbohydrates, which results into maltose and other simple sugars. Although they are the same with the pancreatic amylase has a different source, which is from the pancreas. And then our small intestine produces lactase and sucrase to further break down disaccharides and convert them or break them down into monosaccharides. And then the proteases, which includes the pepsin, trypsin, chymo, chymotrypsin, and then peptidases. Pepsin comes from the stomach, all of which are designed to break down proteins. Now the pepsin comes, its target macronutrient is the proteins, and its end product are large peptides. And then the trypsin and chymotrypsin or chymotrypsin, which is from our pancreas, targets polypeptides and breaks them down into simpler, smaller peptides. And then peptidases targets these peptides in the small intestine to turn them into amino acids. Then the lipases, this is targeted towards the fats or lipids, still from the pancreas, and its end products are fatty acids and glycerol. The stomach does do some absorption too, though not as heavy as the small intestine. Now, some medicines such as aspirin, water, and alcohol are all absorbed through the stomach. This digested bolus is now called chyme, and it leaves the stomach by passing to the pyloric sphincter. Now, this is the if our esophagic sphincter is the entrance, and then our pyloric sphincter is the exit from our stomach. Now, from being a bolus, the bolus now is has now turned into a chyme. Now, chyme is very similar to the consistency of that of a lugaw. Mura na siya og lugaw. You will notice that when you nang mag-vomit ka. If you vomit, you will see an example of chyme. Chyme na naimong gisuka. Muna siya. The chyme is now in the small intestine. We have made it through from the mouth, through the esophagus. We have turned the bolus into chyme, and now it is in the. We have made it now to the small intestine, where majority of the absorption occurs. The liver and pancreas help the small intestine to maximize absorption by contributing their own enzymes and bile salts. Now, bile comes from our liver. The small intestine is further broken down into three parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Ileum. In the duodenum, bile produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder uses the bile duct to enter the small intestine. Also, bile targets in the digestion of lipids. And then the pancreatic juice from pancreas, which is a combination of several enzymes, reduce the acidity of the chyme. Now, in our jejunum is also where the if in the small intestine it's the majority of the absorption, uh, then in the jejunum of the small intestine is where the majority of the absorption occurs. Now in duodenum, it is just the entrance, and then the jejunum is the main compartment. Now this is where finger-like projections called villi, which also has microvilli in it, has enables in the absorption of the nutrients. Now, the more villi there are, of course, the greater the absorption. Now, this is where our capillaries are mostly attached to, in our villi and microvilli, because this is where the different micronutrients are being absorbed and then passes through the capillaries that has been attached to the villi. Each villi itself has tiny finger-like projections called microvilli. And then the ileum, the last portion of the small intestine, is the boundary between the large intestine and the jejunum. Now, in this segment of the small intestine, there are fewer villi that will be observed. And then in the ileum, this is where the chyme that has been uh, the chyme that has been completely sucked up, or not completely, but has been sucked up of the nutrients, starts to solidify. So from being dry in our outside our mouth, it it turns into wet as we chew, and then it becomes wetter at it as it enters as it is being digested in the stomach, and then it starts to dry up in our small intestine, and by the time it is in our small in it and by the time it has reached the ileum, it dries up further. So may muna siyang feces. Now this is very nutrient deficient because all of majority of it because the majority of the nutrients has been absorbed already in the jejunum. Now, this nutrient deficient chyme now enters the large intestine through the ileum, the exit part of the small intestine. And then the large intestine or our colon is used to absorb water from the waste material. So this is where our uh, our this is where our feces form in our colon or large intestine. Now, why water is being absorbed? Its purpose is to produce vitamin K and B vitamins using the good bacteria that live there. So this is where our lactobacillus are thriving in our one of the good bacteria species that are inhabiting our large intestine. This is also where most parasites would be detected in our large intestine because it is very hugaw. Not most, but some could reach up to our small intestine. Now, that's a different discussion, but we'll just focus on the process of digestion. Now, since water is being absorbed from the waste, then it starts to solidify, and then that's our feces. All of our waste is compacted and stored at the end of the large intestine, which is called the rectum. Ano siya, reservoir sa atong tai. And then, when it is full, the anal sphincter, the valve in at the end of our rectum, loosens, and then our feces passes out of the body through the anus. Of course, this will signal our brain that the muscles here will signal our brain that it is time to go to the comfort room. Now, it is bad to hold it in, so follow your heart na lang. Because we will know why it is bad in holding in your feces when it is time to let it go. The accessory organs of the human digestion system. These organs have almost equal responsibility for the digestion of our food as they excrete enzymes and bile. And we have been taught that enzymes are catalysts that improves the output of our body processes. And as what we have seen earlier, these accessory organs are called some of them are called the salivary glands, the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. I am very sorry for the misspelling. Now, the pancreas, its first responsibility is to produce pancreatic juices, which helps in lowering the acidity of the chyme. And then its second purpose is to break down almost all categories of food. Because if you remember from the table earlier, the pancreas all secretes enzymes that belong to that breaks down carbohydrates, proteins, and even lipids. Now all of these enzymes are being secreted into the duodenum or the entrance segment of our small intestine. The liver is located just under our diaphragm. It is connected to the gallbladder where bile is stored. And then bile is pumped into the duodenum if there is presence of fatty food. So bile is also mainly targeting lipids to break it down into fatty acids and glycerols. Now, the bile is produced by the cells in the liver. Now, not the digestive system is not an independent system. It needs the help of the other organ systems for it to function optimally. Now, without the circulatory systems, the nutrients that are being absorbed in our small intestine cannot be transported throughout our body. And then our nervous systems helps in signaling us when to eat and when to defecate or poo poo. This also helps in controlling the gut motility because if because peristalsis is an independent no not an independent is a involuntary movement caused by the our muscles smooth muscles that are attached to the nerves. If it stops in moving, then our food or the bolus cannot travel to where it is supposed to go. So mag-ungot ra na imong bolus imong tutunlan kung wala tay involuntary motion of our smooth muscles in our digestive system. If not, in in our lower in our large intestine, magpundo ra po na imong feces, imong large intestine if peristalsis is not involuntary. Because for example, if it is voluntary, then tungod sa imong kabisi, you forget to move your feces in your large intestine, so several adverse things could happen. And then our endocrine systems, which regulates the digestive juices, and then the major and then the MVP of this is our muscular systems, where smooth muscles perform the involuntary peristalsis. And then the endocrine, nervous, digestive, and circulatory systems all contribute to control our digestion. Now, if you are eating too much or eating too uh, what do you call this? If you don't eat too much, then there's some hormonal imbalance in your body, which can cause into these two common disorders, the anorexia nervosa and anorexia bulimia. Is it bulimia? Where nervosa is where you don't want to eat, and then the other one is where you cannot stop eating. Now, an example of this coordination of our different organ systems is that when before we eat, we smell food that smells good, or for example, if makakita mo tao na mukaon og mangga, if they eat like the raw mango, you notice that your mouth starts to salivate, maglaway ka. That's because it indicates that that food is good. So our mouths and gastrin in our stomachs are now activated, which prepares the body for a meal or snack. A large meal activates receptors that churns the stomach and empty it faster. So if you eat less, then your receptors will not activate as actively compared to when you eat large meals. If the meal was high in fat, digestion is slowed because lipids are very large molecules. So it needs more time to be broken down. That's why it's not really healthy to eat fatty foods because especially if it is not being used right away. If it is being stored, mo na mapurma na imong bilbil. But that also depends on the metabolism of an individual. There are those that murarag wala, misad pila naka serving ilang nakaon. And then we have here the common uh, digestive system illnesses. We have here the GERD or the gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now, this occurs when stomach acid chronically flows back into the esophagus. If acid reflux is not threatening, but when it is chronic, then there is something wrong in your digestive system. This is resulted to a weakened lower esophageal sphincter, kanang imong valve, the valve just above your stomach bitaw. Mura na kanang compared nimo sa pultahan na gitaya na bisagra. That's that's how that's the reason why your acid chronically flows up into the esophagus. Now this causes heartburn and potential tissue damage because acid, unlike the stomach, the mucus lining in our esophagus is not as equally potent one compared to the mucus lining in the stomach. Now we have peptic ulcers. These are painful sores that develop on the inner lining of the stomach or in the duodenum, mostly caused by an infection with Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria or a continuous or prolonged use of uh, anti non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like I think mefenamic and ibuprofen belong to that group belongs to that group. Mefenamic bitaw. If you continuously if your body is fully dependent on mefenamic and ibuprofen, then you're more likely to develop peptic ulcers. And then we have IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. This is characterized by abdominal pain, bloating, butod, and altered bowel habits. Sometimes you have loose bowel movement, and then sometimes you are constipated without visible signs of damage or disease in the digestive tract. Now, IBS is more like a inconsistency in your bowel movement. There are days na you are very loose, magkaigit-igit ka. And then there are times that you are constipated, tubol. You know, that's because you are not taking in enough fiber in your diet. That's why you are more likely to develop this IBS. And then celiac disease. This is more in line with the immune system, the autoimmune disorder, where ingestion of gluten leads to damage in the small intestine. So, if you are familiar with lactose intolerance, that's why if you intake milk, for example, if you're intaking dietary goods like cheese, anything with milk or based in milk, you are uh, this will result in the damaging of your small intestine and then hampering your nutrient absorption. Gluten. This is gluten is like related siya sa milk. Example lang na siya. And then gallstones, hardened deposit of digestive fluid, usually cholesterol that can form in the gallbladder and blocks bile ducts causing severe pain. Now, yung gallstones is similar to kidney stones. Now, there are good and bad cholesterols. And then the bad cholesterols, if it happens that they solidify in your near your duodenum, then it can most likely block the bile ducts in your gallbladder. Now, of course, since pressure will build up in your gallbladder, since it cannot pump the bile outside or into the duodenum, of course you will feel pain because of the pressure, the building up pressure. And I think the only way to cure this is through surgery, like very intensive na in surgery. I do not know if there are remediation or pwede ra ka mo na magtambal ani. I think it's not really that common, especially there is Philippines. It would be good if there are many other digestive system illnesses, but they are more likely to be in line to vector-borne diseases, just like amoebiasis, parasitism. You also have cholera, diarrhea. I think diarrhea is just a symptom. If we Here is how you maintain a healthy digestive system. Of course, we have to have a regular intake of dietary fiber. Now we can get this from fruits, vegetables, and whole grains as they regulate the bowel movement and supports the healthy gut microbiome in our intestines. We cannot afford to be dehydrated as well because hydration helps to dissolve fats and soluble fiber, allowing food to pass through the intestines more smoothly. We also have to chew our food thoroughly. Dili lang kay 1, 2, 3, for tulon. I think there was a recommended amount of chewing, which is around 20, to thoroughly or properly chew the food so that it can be broken down easier in our gastrointestinal tract. I do not know if it is 20 or 17, but I think it's around that curve. You can look it up. If correct me if I'm wrong, because I actually forgot the number, but I think it is around that range. The amount of chewing that you need to do when you eat your food, because the lesser you chew, the more chunky your bolus is, and the chunkier it is, the more inconsistent the digestion will be, especially in the absorption na segment, because your chyme is going to be very inconsistent, manggod. And then some of the nutrients would still be intact on the chunks. And then we have here probiotics and prebiotics, which helps in the health, which helps in the microbiome in our body. You know, kato sila lactobacillus bitaw, the good bacteria in our gut. And then stress management. We I think we have heard of the term stress eating, manggod. So if we have poor stress management, then we are more likely to do that, which is unhealthy for our gut. Because if you eat more frequently than because if we eat more frequently than our usual routine, then our body would have to adjust to that change. And wala siya manamka because your gut is still adapting, but to the is still adapting, which turns to inconsistent digestion and absorption of nutrients. Unang, ana yun na siya. If you have poor stress management, then it's like a chain reaction. Tanan-tanan na siya madamay-damay na na tanan. And that is all, I think. Yeah. Further questions or clarifications, chat lang mo sa GC. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.